My sister works in a lab. My brother announced to a ballroom full of the most prestigious cancer researchers in the country, his hand gesturing vaguely in my direction with the kind of dismissal that only comes from genuinely believing your own narrative about someone's limitations, his voice designed to broadcast that he found me endearing but ultimately irrelevant. Nice girl. Very dedicated to her little projects. She's always tinkering with something in her lab, trying to figure things out. You know how some people get hobbies? For Victoria, it's like she's convinced she's going to discover something revolutionary in her little research setup. The assembled scientists and medical professionals smiled politely, the kind of smile you give when someone mentions a hobby they be misconstrued into something that sounds almost professional, the kind of smile that suggested they were already thinking about other things, already dismissing what he said as the irrelevant aside of a successful man bragging about his less successful sister. I stood there in my black dress at the American Cancer Society's annual research gala, watching my brother accept the Kellerman Prize for Breakthrough Cancer Research, watching him hold the award above his head like he'd just discovered something revolutionary and paradigm-shifting. When in reality he'd been researching the same cellular pathway for a decade without actually solving anything meaningful, making incremental progress that sounded important when presented to people with the right credentials, but that ultimately hadn't produced a single drug that could actually save a human life. But what my brother didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom knew, was that I hadn't just solved what he'd been researching for 10 years. I'd gone beyond it. I'd created something that would save an estimated 47,000 lives in the first year alone. I'd developed a medication that would fundamentally change how we treat oncology. I'd done everything he claimed to have done, and I'd done it while working in the margins of his shadow, while letting him believe I was a lab technician with big dreams and no results. Didn't he ever wonder why I never talked about my work? The gala was being held at the Grand Hyatt in San Francisco, which meant the room was filled with people I'd known for years through professional conferences and networking events, but who didn't actually know me at all in any meaningful way. There was Dr. Marcus Webb, the former director of the NIH, who'd overseen billions in cancer research funding and whose judgment about which research was worth supporting had shaped the entire landscape of American cancer research. There was Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the brilliant oncologist whose work with immunotherapy had fundamentally revolutionized treatment protocols and had saved countless lives already. There were venture capitalists interested in biotech investments, pharmaceutical executives constantly evaluating new compounds and new approaches, medical journalists looking for their next major story, the kind of journalists who could make or break a researcher's reputation with a single article. This was the kind of event where reputations were made and breakthroughs were announced. Where you needed to be accepted by the medical establishment in order to be heard, where the right introduction could open doors that would otherwise remain permanently closed. My brother, Michael Patterson, had been working in cancer research for 15 years. He had a prestigious position at Stanford's Cancer Center. He had a team of 12 researchers working under him. He had published papers in peer-reviewed journals. He had presented at international conferences. He had built a career on the foundation of being the brilliant research scientist. And in exactly 45 minutes, all of that narrative was going to become completely irrelevant. I was 34 years old, and according to my family's understanding of my life, a narrative they deconstructed and refined over years of family dinners and casual conversations, I was the cautionary tale. I'd gotten a PhD in biochemistry from MIT, which my parents had been proud of until I decided not to follow the conventional academic trajectory that had been outlined for me before I even understood what trajectory meant. I'd turned down faculty positions at major universities that would have given me the kind of prestige that my family could brag about. I'd turned down lucrative offers from pharmaceutical companies that would have provided the six-figure salary that would have allowed me to live the kind of life my family considered successful. Instead, I'd founded my own research company, Patterson Biopharmaceuticals, deliberately using my own name, not our family name, because I wanted complete separation from my family's identity, wanted to build something that was entirely mine, wanted the success or failure to belong to me alone. And I'd spent the last 8 years developing something that my family thought was a fantasy. A delusion, a wasted investment of both time and money. My brother had a different theory. He thought I worked in a lab doing routine testing for some clinical research company. He thought I made a modest salary. He thought my projects were peripheral to the real work of actual research scientists like himself. He built his entire sense of professional superiority on the assumption that his work mattered and mine didn't. What he didn't understand, what very few people understood because I deliberately kept my research quiet, kept my clinical trials private, kept my FDA submissions confidential, was that I developed a proprietary treatment protocol for a specific subset of pancreatic cancers that had historically maintained a 5% survival rate at 5 years, a cancer type that was considered essentially untreatable, a diagnosis that meant essentially a death sentence. My treatment protocol showed a 73% survival rate at 5 years in my phase 3 clinical trials. I hadn't just developed a medication. I developed a combination therapy that used a novel mechanism of action to target specific cellular pathways that my brother's research had only begun to theorize about but never actually managed to effectively address. I'd taken his theoretical framework, expanded it in ways he couldn't imagine, and created something that actually worked, something that saved lives instead of just generating publications and securing grant funding. And 3 hours ago, the FDA had approved my Phase 3 clinical trial data. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator was saying, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the particular authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, we're pleased to announce this year's Kellerman Prize recipient. The Kellerman Prize, as you know, is awarded annually to a researcher whose work demonstrates the most significant breakthrough potential in cancer research. This year's recipient has published 18 papers in peer-reviewed journals, has secured substantial funding, and has demonstrated remarkable theoretical insights into pancreatic cancer treatment protocols. Dr. Michael Patterson of Stanford University, for his groundbreaking research into pancreatic cancer treatment protocols. Dr. Patterson, please come accept your award. I watched my brother walk to the stage. He was wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than my monthly research budget, though my monthly research budget was now quite substantial given the backing I'd assembled for my work. His hair was perfectly styled by someone whose job was probably to ensure his appearance remained exactly as impressive as his professional reputation suggested it should be. He had the bearing of someone who spent his entire life assuming the world would validate his importance, that success was essentially guaranteed given his credentials and his networking and his particular confidence in his own vision. He took the award from the hands of the previous year's recipient, a woman who'd actually developed a drug that was saving lives, and he held it up like he'd just accomplished something that mattered. I want to thank my team at Stanford, he was saying, and I watched him perform gratitude for people he probably took credit for. I want to thank the funding agencies that believed in this research. I want to thank my family for supporting my vision, even when my sister. He paused, looking down at me with that particular smile that suggested pity, didn't quite understand what real research looked like. The ballroom laughed. The kind of laugh that happens when someone in power makes a joke at someone else's expense and everyone feels permission to enjoy it. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. I pulled it out discreetly and looked at the screen. Messages from my VP of Research. From my CFO. From my legal team. From my board of directors. All marked urgent. I opened my email and read the message that had been sent 47 minutes ago. Dr. Patterson, we are pleased to inform you that your Phase 3 clinical trial data has been evaluated and approved by the FDA. Your medication demonstrates efficacy exceeding our expectations and safety profiles within acceptable parameters. Your compound is approved for expedited market access. Commercial availability is projected for next quarter. Based on preliminary market analysis, the projected impact of your treatment protocol in the first year of market availability is estimated at 47,000 lives saved in the United States market alone. I sat in my chair, completely still, holding the phone in my hands, and I understood that everything was about to change. My brother was still speaking. Something about collaboration. Something about how great research required both vision and patience. Something about how not everyone had what it took to contribute to meaningful scientific advancement. He was still performing his narrative about how his work was significant and mine was a hobby. I waited until he finished his speech. I waited until he walked back off the stage. I waited until he returned to the table where I was sitting with our parents and made that particular joke about how at least I'd shown up to support his achievement. Then I pulled up the FDA letter on my phone and slid it across the table to him, letting him read it himself. Watching his face as the reality of what he was seeing began to penetrate his understanding of what his success actually meant in comparative terms. Congratulations, I said quietly, my voice measured and professional, the kind of voice that doesn't suggest anger or vindication but just calm statement of fact. On your award. But I thought you should know that my little projects just got FDA approval. My Phase 3 trial data came back 47 minutes ago. 73% 5-year survival rate for pancreatic cancer, the cancer type you've been researching for 10 years without solving. The medication goes to market next quarter. Estimated impact, 47,000 lives saved in the first year in the United States alone. That doesn't include international markets, where the impact will be substantially larger. Michael picked up the phone and read the email from the FDA, his fingers trembling slightly as he processed what he was seeing. I watched his face go through a series of expressions, confusion, then skepticism as he looked for something that would invalidate what he was reading, then comprehension as he understood that this was absolutely real. Then something that might have been shame or might have been anger or might have been some complicated mixture of both. This isn't real, he said. It's absolutely real, I said. Check the sender. It's the FDA. Check the letterhead. It's official correspondence. Your research award is for theoretical breakthrough potential. My medication will actually save people's lives. There's a difference. How is this possible? He asked. You never mentioned any of this. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you dismissed it, I said, keeping my voice level, professional, the voice I use in board meetings when discussing clinical trial outcomes. You called it a hobby. You introduced me tonight as someone with little projects. You build your entire professional identity on the assumption that your work mattered and mine didn't. So I stopped trying to explain it. I just built it. Our mother was staring at the phone. Our father was trying to read the email over Michael's shoulder. The other guests at our table were becoming aware that something significant was happening, though they weren't quite sure what. I need to make some calls, I said, standing up. I have board members who need to be briefed. I have pharmaceutical companies that will want to discuss distribution. I have media who will want to cover this story. I have a company to manage. I have a medication to get to market. I have 47,000 lives to save in the first year. I left the gala and stepped outside into the San Francisco night. The city sprawled below the hotel, lights spreading across the bay in a way that suggested infinite possibility, each light representing someone going about their life, someone who might someday benefit from what I'd built, someone who might be saved by my medication. My phone started ringing immediately, with a regularity that suggested the calls would continue for days, for weeks, probably for years. News organizations wanting exclusive interviews. Medical journals requesting early access to my clinical data. Pharmaceutical executives suddenly interested in distribution partnerships. My board members celebrating the FDA approval, understanding already what this meant for the company's valuation. Investors wanting to discuss market strategy, wanting to be part of something that everyone now understood was going to be historically significant. I took the calls in sequence throughout the night, confirming details with the FDA, discussing timelines with manufacturing partners, outlining the strategy for market entry with my business development team. By the time I'd finished all the initial calls, it was past midnight. By the time the news had broken on the medical networks and begun spreading across social media, Michael's award had been completely and thoroughly overshadowed. The headlines were everywhere by morning. Brilliant young scientist develops pancreatic cancer treatment with 73% 5-year survival rate, FDA approves revolutionary oncology medication, estimated 47,000 lives to be saved in first year, Patterson Biopharmaceuticals CEO develops breakthrough treatment while medical community overlooked her work. Michael called at 9 a.m. His voice was different. Not confident. Not patronizing. Just shocked. Victoria, he said. Everyone's calling me asking about you. The medical community is saying this is one of the most significant breakthroughs in oncology in the last decade. I know, I said. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Because you wouldn't have listened, I said. You would have told me I was working on something impossible. You would have explained to me why my approach was theoretically flawed. You would have tried to correct my methodology. You would have, essentially, managed me the way you manage everyone in your life. I didn't want that. I wanted to build something on my own terms. But we could have collaborated, he said. We could have. No, I said. We couldn't have. Because collaboration with you would have meant subordinating my vision to your authority. It would have meant explaining myself constantly. It would have meant dealing with your doubts every step of the way. Instead, I built something that speaks for itself. I built something that doesn't need your validation or your blessing. I built something that will save more lives than you'll save in your entire career. There was a long silence. I'm sorry, he said finally. For how I introduced you. For how I've talked about you. I know, I said. But you know what's interesting? Your dismissal of my work actually helped me. Because if I'd been trying to prove something to you, I would have been distracted. If I'd been seeking your validation, I would have compromised. Instead, I was completely focused on the science. I was completely focused on solving the problem. And that focus, that singular purpose, is what allowed me to accomplish something that nobody else has accomplished. I hung up and looked at my calendar. I had a meeting with the FDA in 2 hours. I had a presentation to my board about market strategy. I had media interviews scheduled throughout the day. I had drug companies calling to discuss distribution partnerships. I had the mechanism of medicine and commerce beginning to move around my breakthrough. By the end of the week, my company's valuation had increased by $8.3 billion. By the end of the month, I was being featured in every major scientific publication and every business magazine. By the end of the quarter, my medication had begun the process of entering the market, beginning to save the lives that nobody, including my brother, had believed were savable. Michael's award sat on his shelf at Stanford. But my medication would sit in hospitals and clinics and patient homes across the country, extending lives, giving people more time with their families, achieving something that his research had never been able to achieve. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is build something so significant that it renders other people's narratives about you completely irrelevant, so undeniable that they have no choice but to acknowledge your success whether they want to or not. Sometimes the best response to dismissal isn't argument or rebuttal. It's accomplishment. It's building something so real, so significant, so undeniably important that every conversation becomes about what you've done rather than about their narrative of what they thought you couldn't do. I thought about all the nights I'd spent in my lab, alone, working in complete solitude, developing this treatment protocol. I thought about all the times I could have been seeking validation from my family or trying to convince my colleagues or spending energy proving something to my brother, but instead I was focused entirely on solving a problem that mattered, that would save lives, that would extend survival for people who'd been told their diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. I thought about how my brother had spent a decade researching something without actually solving it, while I'd solved something far more difficult and far more important, something that would change the landscape of cancer treatment forever. The estimated 47,000 lives saved in the first year turned out to be conservative. In the actual first year of market availability, my medication extended 57,000 lives. In the second year, 98,000 lives. In the third year, the number was beyond calculation because the medication had become standard treatment protocol and the lives saved became part of the baseline expectation. My brother continued his research at Stanford. His work became interesting again, once people understood that he was pursuing secondary protocols that could complement my medication. We eventually did collaborate, on my terms, when he finally understood that I wasn't someone to manage but someone to respect. But that first moment, that moment at the gala when I showed him the FDA approval while he held his award, that moment belonged entirely to me. That was the moment when he finally understood that his sister hadn't been working on little projects in a lab. She'd been saving the world. And she'd been doing it while he was too busy being disappointed in her to notice what she was actually building.